Teresa, thank you so much for joining me today. It's an absolute delight to have you here. And for those people who don't know you very well, tell us what you do.
So I work in the organisational development and professional development space, but essentially what I do is I help organisations to build high trust cultures and high performing teams.
Brilliant. And you've got some really exciting news at the moment, haven't you?
I do. I released a book on trust. It's been many, many years in the making. But yeah, it's super exciting to finally have it out there.
Do you want to show us the cover? Please.
There's something I said earlier. Yeah, so that's it. Currency of Connection.
The Currency of Connection. Stunning. Yeah. Okay. And where can people get it?
Sorry?
Where can people get hold of it?
Oh, Amazon. So it's available on Amazon in Kindle and paperback internationally. So
okay, fantastic. So what I'll do is I'll make sure that I publish the full title and where people can get it after this conversation. So Teresa, I was so excited when you came back to me and said your book's been published and you're ready to have a chat, because there couldn't be a more critical time where trust is right at the forefront of every single thing that we do. Tell me about what you've seen so far and how you've had to adjust, and what you're seeing with your clients and organizations in terms of what's going on through the COVID-19 pandemic.
So it's interesting, right? Because when I first started talking about trust many years ago, people would see its value, but kind of almost treat it as a nice to have. It's great, but does it really help with business efficiency or effectiveness or performance? And now when you think about the environment that we're in right now with COVID, where it's thrown everyone into this sort of survival mode. So whether it's a business that's fighting for its survival or people like us who are looking to maintain our revenue, it's kind of, or our income, and thinking about, we don't know what the future is going to look like. So we go immediately into self-preservation. And when we do that, we immediately withdraw. So when we're fighting for our survival, we're not in the right space of wanting to connect with other people, because it becomes about us and looking after ourselves and protecting our own agenda and making sure that we and our families are safe, or for a business, making sure that the business is safe. So what I've been seeing as I've been speaking to CEOs internationally around COVID is the concern that businesses who started out, in February thinking, this won't be a big deal, or it won't necessarily affect our country, and if it does, it won't be too deep. Suddenly go into various stages of lockdown, suddenly then have to start putting into place some of the scenarios that they had looked at that they thought they might never need to action, which has meant reducing numbers, which has meant reducing or asking people to take a cut in salary for a period of time, which can be, and lots of people are reviewing that month to month because leaders don't know what's coming. And, clients of mine who are in the retail sector who are saying we're supposed to be opening back up now, but we don't know if we're even going to have footfall because people, we've got staff who are concerned about coming back in because they're worried about health concerns. And the important thing there is that you can't have fear and trust. They don't coexist. They're not natural bedfellows, right? So suddenly trust becomes this very real inhibitor to us being able to actually do anything, because we're looking at protecting ourselves first and foremost. Whether you're a leader in a business who's trying to protect the business and looking at how best to do that without losing the trustworthiness of their staff, or whether you're an employee thinking, well, I've got to look after myself and therefore it's every man for themselves and I've got to protect my own job. And ultimately, one of the conversations we've been talking about a lot is around, when you're a leader navigating the scale of change where not only do you not know what's going on, but no one really knows what's going on. No one knows how far-reaching this is going to be, how long it's going to take, when things are going to pick back up. And no one really knows to what extent they're going to be rebuilding or restarting or redefining their operating model or their offer. So it's like there's so much uncertainty that leaders have never really been prepared for something like this before. So the clients that I'm speaking to are almost discovering things, with all the best intentions in the world and all their incredible mental agility and emotional agility, they're discovering things as they unfold. And so they're looking for new ways. And what I've noticed is that it feels almost as though the world is shaking down into people and organizations who are waiting for this to pass, and people and organizations who are saying, wow, yeah, it's scary, but you know what? We can throw out the rule book and start again. And my sense is that one of those has a spirit of discovery and agility built in, and one of those is holding on to what always was and hoping that that returns.
So would you, I love that, you know, of course, when we look at the neuroscience around fear, and as you say, the world is almost running on fear right now. You know, fear and trust cannot coexist in the same space. So, you know, looking at organizations that, and we're seeing this absolutely everywhere, that are just sitting tight and hoping that this too will pass, right?
Yeah. You can't blame them, right? It's like...
No, of course. I mean, that's a fear-based response, right? So to get from fear to trust, trust needs to take on a different shape and form altogether. Right, so trust in government, well, you know, debatable, right, wherever you're sitting in the world right now. And if you think your government's bad, then just start listening to what other people are saying in their countries, sure. Right? You know? And so governments, organizations, institutions, you know, leaders, I mean, you just bring it down to and self. I mean, fundamentally, it's got to start with self, the smallest common denominator, and arguably the largest common denominator.
Correct. Well, it's the only thing, ourselves we are the only thing that we can control. So, and it's interesting because it's I would say to people, and I was on a workshop, delivering a virtual workshop around psychological safety last week, because psychological and safety and trust are kind of similar concepts, right? Because psychological safety is about the ability to be really open and honest and vulnerable, and to be able to share your thoughts and ideas without a sense of judgment or being seen to be wrong. And trust is kind of similar, but what's interesting is that actually trust does start with you. But when you're thinking about an organization, it's really important as well that people who have the loudest voices, and sometimes it's always leaders, but it's also sometimes those real change agents, or the people who have not necessarily positional power, but they are vocal. And so helping them to understand the role that they have at a time like this, and what it takes, what trust really means, how to build it, and what it really takes to build trust. Because it's incredible to me how simple a concept trust really is, but how difficult it is to really grasp and to embody and to present.
Okay, I'm going to harness you right there and say, tell us how to build trust. Tell us the building blocks. What does trust actually look like when you unpack it?
There's a book that I've got that you could read. No, quite seriously, it's the very first thing I would almost say that the first thing I would focus on is just understanding how to be vulnerable, appreciating the power of vulnerability. Because there are steps to build trust, but the very first thing that you need to get right is preparing yourself to become vulnerable. And that doesn't mean making yourself weak. It means making yourself human. Because if you can't, particularly as a leader, if you can't make yourself human, if you can't admit that you don't have all the answers, that you don't know, that you are co-creating the way forward, and that you need to bring all voices to the table, then you are not creating an environment that allows all voices to come to the table. So the very first thing that you really need to do is to create that sense of vulnerability being okay. But you also need to understand what that looks like, because it's not vulnerability in the sense that you've taken your hands off the wheel and you don't know what's going on. You're telling everyone that you're panicking. It's saying, look, we don't know what the future looks like. We have plans. We've got contingencies. But what we want to do is to understand from all voices in the organisation what the perspectives are. Because when you're at a time of great change, the best thing that you can do for your organisation is to access the wisdom, the intelligence, and the emotional acuity of the people around you, because everyone has a different worldview, and so everyone will be contributing a different element that'll help you to create something that's more robust going forward.
Yeah, it's just lovely to hear you verbalize all of those things that we inherently know to be true. Right? Absolutely. Yeah. And, Teresa, what's really struck me over the last couple of months is that all of our myths and truths about life, about how life should work, how leaders should be, how organizations should be and governments should be, and, what should happen. This lovely word should, could, should, would, right?
Yes, yeah.
And all of those myths and truths are falling away, before our eyes. And I think almost for many people leaves a sense of, and I've heard, I've got a couple of clients who are, one particular client who springs to mind in investment banking, and she said to me, what a relief, I don't need to know all the answers, and there's no possible way of doing so. And for the first time, I'm actually encouraging, the quietest person in the room to step forward, because often their ideas are probably, are profoundly more intuitive or insightful than perhaps the loudest person in the room. And I think we're seeing a whole shift in how we actually view the world. And my sense, and I'm getting that it's yours too, is this is just such a beautiful opportunity to shape shift the world that we want, what we want it to look like, to be like, to feel like. Because the trust in our institutions across all aspects of life just isn't there anymore in the way that it was. And perhaps it was a filter of trust that wasn't deserving, or that they didn't necessarily deserve. But it served us to believe in the narrative. It served us to believe in the myths and the truths that we held so closely and so dear. So your sense, and Teresa, around this incredible opportunity to build what we want it to be.
Because it's, if you think about what I was referring to a moment ago, which was around vulnerability being the biggest hurdle to actually starting to build trust, because trust is about credibility, it's about connection, it's about consistency. But ultimately, if you don't get the vulnerability piece right, people just don't connect at the right level. They know inherently that it's not quite true. And so it makes it very, very hard for people to really have that sense of trustworthiness in you. And that's why trust in governments can be so easily broken, because people want to trust, but they're always waiting for the other shoe to drop, And it's when people know that you're going to be consistent, that you're credible, that you have a deep connection with them, that they will then start to actually invest in you. And it is like connection is like a currency. We invest and we believe and we give something of ourselves. And the incredible opportunity that we have right now is that because the entire world has been leveled, and in terms of the playing field is just leveled for everybody around the world. No one really knows. No one is expected to have the answer. Everyone has had to pivot to what life looks like. So leaders and humans have never had a better opportunity to admit that actually we don't know what we don't know, but hey, we're confident, we've got the courage and the bravery and the grit to figure it out, and we can lead the charge in figuring it out. But it would be really helpful if we had other people's perspectives as well, because without that cognitive diversity, without that cultural diversity, there might be something we're missing.
Yeah,
and I think that's where the real power is, and the real opportunity for leaders now is to say, hey, what if we all knit together? We're going to lead the charge, but actually it's a responsibility for all of us now to think about what we can contribute moving forward. And I think it's more important because if you think about the changes that organisations have had to go through, the mammoth transformations to enable people to work remotely, those kinds of transformation programs would usually take months, and people had to execute them in weeks, right? So if you think about what we have now proven is possible, we've now stripped back all these assumptions that we've had around working from home, around digital transformations, around technology. When I left London in 2016, all of my clients were saying, you really need to be here face to face, and now, this week I'm working with clients in Dubai and London and NZ out of Melbourne. So when you're looking at a world where all of our assumptions have been stripped away, everybody is at zero and looking at how we can figure things out, you've never had a better opportunity. I don't think we'll ever have another opportunity like that, I hope, in our lifetime to really figure out what our future looks like together.
Yeah, it's amazing, and it's an open book. I'm laughing, Teresa, because I've been working globally as well since 2005. So sitting in London, working with clients in Australia or in Brazil or Reykjavik or extraordinary places around the world. And I think for some people who are used to working, in a digitized way or a virtualized way, great. But at the same time, I'm still seeing little requests and things like that on various social platforms saying, does anyone know of somebody in this area? And I'm laughing and thinking, well, it doesn't really matter what area that person's in anymore, spread the net wide and rather go for the best qualified person. So it does shift the game completely. So this brings us back to your earlier point, Teresa, about connection. So, just looking at this world of work and, probably I would imagine that in time we're going to be looking at some sort of hybrid system of working. And that actually, takes into consideration how businesses function better. Developers working between midnight and 3 is probably their preference. Why force them to come into an office, as somebody said on one of these conversations the other day. But at the same time, so taking into consideration people's preferences, but then how do we build connection with a hybrid type situation? Twitter has said, go home and forever. And, perhaps we might open up and then it might be a choice for you to come back. And I think many businesses will be doing that. So, creating connection in let's call it a hybrid world, because I don't think it's going to be the virtualized world that we're sitting in today, which is like, I guess the hard cut. We're going to start looking at something that is way more mutable going forward. So how do we build that trust? How do we build that connection in that environment?
That's a really good question. Because I actually, I would almost say, I don't know that we do a great job of it. I don't know that we were doing a great job of building trust before we went virtual, or before we went remote. So actually, I think if anything, again, and look, call me an eternal optimist, but I think this has given us an opportunity to put trust at the forefront and think about how we create connection now whilst we're in this space that then continues beyond the space into that hybrid way of working, which I agree with you, I think is coming. And my advice would be that you start to have deeper conversations with people, that you understand how to really relate with each other as humans, that you create the psychological safety, because ultimately that's what it comes back to. Connection and trust, it all comes back to knowing that that it's okay to be who you are. And that, because as soon as you can just be yourself at work, you free up all the other energy that you would usually be using for image management or emotional control or any of those other things, and you're able to focus completely on being present in the conversations that you're having and completely present doing the work that you're doing. And so there's no conversations that get misunderstood. There's no conflict that is ultimately constructive, because people are able to have the kind of conflict where they know other people have their backs, but you don't get there without psychological safety. So my advice would be, create the time and the space to have conversations, to enable people to have conversations where they can actually connect as human beings. And that really is around, sharing things with each other that sit outside of the usual interactions that they would have together at work. But also, there's layers, different angles that you can come at it from. So one would be having a conversation that lifts the lid on who that human is really behind their job title. Another is, how do we have conversations that allow me to really listen to you, to listen to learn rather than listening to reload? So how can we do that, whether we're virtual or whether we're back in the room together? How do we slow down our bias for action so that we've got a bias for connection instead? Because once you have that connection in place, the action that you take is so much swifter.
So do you think this extraordinary time, and perhaps it'll be 2-3 months for most people, in a sort of almost I know everyone's talking about the Great Reset, but that always sounds like a hard start.
Yeah.
And it feels much more mutable to me, because it may feel like a hard stop. But out of this, we're going to obviously reclaim some things that work, let go of things that don't. probably from a monetary perspective initially, just because it just doesn't pay to keep doing things in that way.
Sure.
But then, if we think of office politics, the posturing that goes on in organizations, and I don't know about you, but I spent the first half of my career in listed companies, and we all know what that feels like, that can feel like. But when we actually take it onto a virtual level, and I've also seen some funny memes where people are joking about teammates who still are, that psychological control, and there's still those office politics going on online, in group, Zooms and team meetings and things like that. But I would imagine that it really won't last long, because that's fingers crossed. But I can't imagine it can last long in a more virtualized dynamic.
What I think is going to happen is I think people will lose their patience for it. So in the same way that the sudden rapid change that everyone's had to make, because you're right, people like you and I who are used to traveling and working virtually, it doesn't feel that much of a shift for us. We have not experienced a disequilibrium that a lot of people have. But if you think about the experience that most people have had, which is, wow, we're not working from home. We are trying to work at home during a pandemic. And some of us are raising children in the background and, Lord forbid, trying to homeschool and whatnot. So I think people's patience for things like office politics is going to just dissolve. And I wonder to what extent that will return when people are back in a hybrid or an office working environment. And it will really sit on the shoulders of the people who are co-creating that culture, whether they are leaders, and primarily leaders will hold the reins on what they allow, the cultural norms that they allow to then take hold when they're back, right? And what I would say as well is we talked a little bit earlier before we jumped on this call around the employment contract changing, people's psychological contract with their employer. Now that they know they can work from home, now that they know it's possible, people who have adjusted, there might be people at home who, once their kids are back at school, would prefer to work from home because it gives them a better balance and enables them to get more work done. And so I think where there is risk, where there's opportunity, there's also risk, because if organizations go back into this hybrid world or kind of morph into the new normal without reflecting on actually what are the great things that we've learned and experienced that we can take forward to create stronger employee engagement, to create higher productivity with less stress. What can we do to create a healthier organization? I think if organizations don't take some of these lessons on board as they move into the new normal, then they will do themselves and their employees a huge disservice. And I think, and you mentioned earlier, now that employees realize that actually the world's opened up, they might be able to work virtually for anyone, anywhere. They now potentially have more options, right? So it may, who knows whether it's going to be an employee's market going forward.
Yeah, it's so interesting playing with all of these ideas and the possibility, right? And my gut feeling, as you mentioned earlier, organizations that are rooted in keeping things the same and perhaps rooted in fear, rather than trusting intuition, gut, the right thing to do, their people. Yeah. The quietest person in the room who pops up with the best idea. I think that, almost the polarization between those two, we've seen so much polarization over the last years, from geopolitics to those organizations who've been perhaps more digitized than others. And all of a sudden, really, in a weird way, we're in this, we're on the same playing field. And the opportunities to emerge from this in a healthy, constructive way will determine people's choices. And the other thing, of course, is that my gut feeling is that over the next 3-4 years, we're going to be making choices about all sorts of things. We're going to be making choices about the countries we want to live in, dependent on how our governments, if we've got the freedom to move and we have a second passport or our partner has, the freedom to migrate somewhere else, dependent on how governments have operated and our trust in big institutions, but also definitely trust in our leaders and trust in our companies. Because if that whittles away and we're left with a fear-based organization that is rooted in keeping things in the past, we're not going to want to work for organizations like that. We're going to, everybody wants to learn and earn at the same time, of course. But right now, I guess the natural thing is to want to hold on to your income and to make sure that your family's safe and things like that. But those drivers are not going to last forever. There's a short little window where that kind of leverage can work well, but certainly not as we move into, in 6 months down the line or 9 months down the line. Not even, that sounds like a really long way away, right? Things changing way too fast to even imagine what things might look like.
Exactly. And I think everyone's still finding their way, but it's interesting because fear is a very natural response. And we don't want to underplay it or dismiss it. Fear is really normal, right? It depends how long you stay in it that determines whether or not it becomes problematic. So fear is part of our normal processing to kind of do a risk assessment and think about what next, to start to plan the different scenarios that might be possible. You're right. People aren't necessarily going to want to stay with an organization that operates and makes decisions from a place of fear, because how do you become innovative? How do you stay relevant if your decisions are based around fear? And ironically, it's interesting because as natural as fear is as a human response, trust is also incredibly natural. And you've said it yourself a couple of times. It's what we know is right. So why is it so incredibly hard, right? And it's because vulnerability feels like we're showing our soft underbelly. But the irony is that the more that you allow yourself to be vulnerable enough for other people to trust you and for you to ask for help or to involve other people in the decision making and in the strategic direction, the easier it becomes, the more weight it takes off your shoulders, and the more right it feels. It's a more organic way of working. And ironically, it's the way that all successful businesses in the knowledge economy have been working. So this, in some sense, if it helps to reset, and as much as because I agree with you, it's not going to be a hard reset button, but if it gives people a moment of pause, if it gives organizations and ELTs and SLTs a moment to take a deep breath and say, hey, you know what? We can't operate like a mechanistic organization anymore. We need to start thinking more holistically, more organically about how the business is operating and how we make the most of the creative intelligence, the emotional intelligence, the cognitive intelligence of our teams, so that we are collectively creating the value streams for this business and looking to constantly evolve and adapt and navigate the world. If I'm hoping that organizations do that, because I do think this is one of the most incredible opportunities that you could ever have to do that. And yes, it's incredibly hard because, yes, very difficult decisions have to be made, but there is still hope in amongst all of that, and there's still optimism in amongst all of that to do it in a way that preserves dignity and trust and respect for others.
Yeah, and connection, absolutely.
And
connection, yeah. It's such an inspiring message. I cannot wait to read your book. And my sentiment at the moment with almost everybody I talk to is, let's have this conversation again in a few months' time, because things are moving so fast. And I'm getting two parts out of what you're saying. One is, there is a brilliant, and I think we all have this sense, opportunity to, the phoenix rises, right, out of the ashes. Mm-hmm. What will you create? And that will be incredibly visible to all of us. And then it also comes with a little bit of a warning. If we don't, people vote with their feet, right? And trust comes as naturally as fear. And if we're not creating those organizations that are worth being in, that are trustworthy in our incredibly transparent world, then we really have missed a trick, so to speak.
I said that of myself, Louise. I think that was beautifully put.
Teresa, thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute delight, and we'll definitely have to do this again. Thank you.
I'd love that. Thank you.